This is The Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from the City University of New York. Today, author-nominated peer reviewers. Our panelists are Leslie Hinkson from Georgetown University, Gabriel Rossman from UCLA, and Christina Sharp from the University of Washington. Our discussion was recorded on May 7th, 2019. So Nature recently reported on a study of peer review at the Swiss National Science Foundation, and it found that peer reviewers are 4 times more likely to give a grant applicant a positive score when they were chosen by the grant applicant. And the finding triggered calls to stop using peer review recommendations by the applicant. So the idea is that I guess people, the charitable interpretation is that everybody understands who will see the true value in their project. And then the uncharitable one is everybody's asking friends who are in on the scam to, get some research money. Obviously, there are people who play this game. I remember in my career, I can remember at least 2 occasions where I met and got along with people who I would characterize as characters in a semi-professional setting. And then I got review requests from funding agencies for projects that I had like absolutely no expertise in. And like the right thing to do there is to say no. You shouldn't review things that you don't do, and you shouldn't interview, stuff based on personal relations. But what
Yeah, because that's not
it's
how
not
it
how it's
works.
supposed to work. Now, how it does work and how it's supposed to work are
Yeah.
2 different things, of course. But on the other hand, you might think, well, science relies on trust to work, and if we don't take authors or grant applicants' recommendations, how are we going to deal with that? Well, are we going to have to? That puts a lot of burden on journals and the grant makers. So, what do you think? Should we do it with applicant or author recommendations, or is there anything? Any sort of practical changes that should be made, or is this a whole lot of nothing in your opinion?
I think did we touch on this, at least like a little bit, when we had Christine
I,
Percheski on? I can't remember if that was part of the recorded bit or if it was like a little bit of
what's that
behind the
with you though? What do
scenes
you remember?
chatter. Yeah, I mean, I basically, like, I remember saying, yeah, it took forever for a journal that will not be named to find reviewers. And, and while I understood that it probably would have totally cut down on the time if I had just given them a list of recommended reviewers, I, I just was committed. I just felt that was like antithetical to like the whole kind of idea of blind review. If I'm giving you the names of people and there's a likelihood that you're going to take them up, that it just seems totally wrong to me. Even though it does actually serve the purpose of helping to cut down on the amount of time that it takes to identify reviewers, and not just identify reviewers, but identify reviewers who would be likely to review the piece, because even though in theory, they don't know whose piece this is. I mean, if you're in the same networks, you kind of understand, you kind of know whose work this is.
So wait, do you feel it's unethical?
I think it's unethical.
So I would draw a big distinction. So we're conflating 2 issues here, and sometimes in reality they go together, right? They can be correlated. But one issue is recommending reviewers, and another issue is reviewers who know who the author is. And, it's a 2x2, right? I mean, there may be a certain weight on the diagonal, but it is a 2x2. So it's entirely possible to recommend a reviewer who has no idea that you wrote the paper. So I'm an editor at Social Science, and so I get to, nothing's blind to me. And all in the cover letters, I'll sometimes see that they request me as the editor to be assigned to it. But I have no idea who that person is. It's just that they looked on our, masthead, saw who the reviewers are, and thought, oh, that guy does culture, so I'll request him, or something like that. Or it could be that, sometimes you'll know who somebody wrote a paper because, oh yeah, I remember that paper. I saw it at ASA, but they may
Hmm.
not have even known that you were in the room, right? Um, so I think it's possible to know who wrote a paper without being recommended, and it's also possible to recommend just because you think, oh yeah, you know who would like this paper? Peter Behrman. I'm going to
Right.
recommend Peter Behrman. So it's just, to a certain extent, this is kind of on the author to recommend people who you think would like the paper or at least are working in that area, without them having been someone who is necessarily aware, and definitely not someone who's given feedback on it, right? So, like, I consider it ethical to recommend a reviewer, even if I know they were in the room when I presented the paper at ASA. But if they read a draft of the manuscript or something like that, I would never recommend that. Basically, if you can be in the if you could plausibly be in the acknowledgments, you should never
Right.
be recommended.
Oh, so you think that there should be kind of like this arm's length kind of rule, like we have for, for tenure and promotion letters.
Well, what's funny is sometimes tenure and promotion letters, you'll get a letter from somebody's advisor or something like that.
You're not
Uh,
supposed to have that. Well, at least not here, but
well, UCLA, we're a little bit more, so, uh, yeah, so,
Well, doesn't that though, Gabriel? Does
yeah, but I also think it's important for kind of some of the reasons Leslie was getting at is that, it's not, there, there's two reasons reviewers could not like a paper. One is because the paper sucks, and the other is because they
Mhm.
just don't get it, right? And
yeah.
and it's actually really hard for managing editors, especially at a generalist journal, to figure out who are who are appropriate reviewers who would understand, uh, what a paper's getting at. Because a lot of times when you don't like a paper, it's not because the paper is bad in some abstract sense. It's just because it doesn't belong in your
Mhm.
area.
Hmm.
And so I've reviewed a couple papers that were about Risk Society, which to me seems like some environmental doomsday cult, not uh, an actual subfield of social science. But so that's an indication not that those papers were
Mhm.
bad necessarily, but that I'm a bad reviewer to be assigned
Right.
those papers. And so and then conversely, I've written stuff on categories or diffusion or whatever, and maybe it goes to a reviewer who's much more interested in hermeneutic approaches to culture, and of course they're not
Mhm.
going to like it. So and like I've had this experience where one of my grad students, like 10 years ago, wrote a paper on now former grad student, we don't have that long for our
Mhm.
time to degree, uh, wrote a paper on local TV news coverage
Mhm.
of crime, and it was a newspaper, right? It was about media production, and the editor ended up assigning it to a bunch of
Mhm.
criminologists. And
Hmm.
so the criminologists are like, why isn't there more on the demographic correlates of peak crime years and
Right.
deterrence and incapacitation, stuff like that? And so, well, it's because it's a media paper. So
Exactly.
and so I think it's actually important to write a cover letter where you clearly say, A, this is the literature I'm speaking to, or better yet, these are the two
Right.
literatures I'm speaking to, or the three literatures I'm speaking to. And then you give examples of people, but I think it's kind of a matter of trust between the author and the editor, that you're not saying, oh, who'd be perfect to review this paper? Joe Cohen and Leslie Hinkson, who I went to grad school with and are
Right.
close friends. You know,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
but to
And
just
who
say,
love
but to
me.
say, so I think I could ethically recommend Huggy
Mhm.
Rao, who I've
Hmm.
met at like a conference or something like 3 times, but we're not especially close. I respect
Mhm.
him a lot. But Huggy and I have had a total of probably 90 minutes of conversation. So I think I could ethically recommend Huggy review one of my papers, but I don't think I could ethically recommend that Joe recommend one of my papers. Although ironically, I once reviewed one of my co-authors'
Hmm.
papers. So I once got assigned. So Oliver Schilke and I wrote a paper on the Oscars as a market information regime, and then I got assigned a paper to review on wine appellations as a market information regime, and I reviewed it and everything, and I had no idea until after I reviewed it that Oliver
Mhm.
wrote it. Uh,
Mm.
so it just because this person was one of my closest collaborators in the
Mhm.
discipline. He just hadn't had mentioned. He's just so goddamn
Mhm.
productive that he writes more papers than he can tell all his co-authors
But
about.
like,
And So I don't know if he recommended me or not, but I was actually able to review it impartially because even though it was written by a close friend and collaborator, I didn't know that he wrote it.
But shouldn't we make something of the fact that like there is an identifiable bias in author nominated reviewers? Like, should we put should an editor put an asterisk
We
beside
should.
an author nominated reviewer? And
Well, I think there's two dimensions, right? Where if the bias is because they are working within your paradigm, I don't consider that a
right.
bias. I consider that good editing to assign somebody like that. And if the author can help that, that's great. If the bias is because they favor
Mhm.
you, because you're friends and there's a conflict of interest, then that is a problem.
So then how can we figure out how to disentangle that? I mean, how, like, as an editor, how do you say, you know what, I want this to be as objective a process as possible. I also want it to be as efficient a process as possible, right? How do I figure out how to use, these recommendations in such a way that, I'm, you know what, I'm not kind of like tipping the scales in favor of people who actually use the reviewer recommendation as a way to just get, whatever, get their social network involved to help ensure their publication.
Yeah, I actually don't have experience with that because we have a weird system at social science where we pretty much only, I mean, not only, but 80% of the time we assign reviewers from our reviewer pool. So unless somebody's named somebody who happens to
Mm-hmm.
be in our reviewer pool, which is fairly small, it's like 50 people,
Mhm.
then I don't go with
Mm-hmm.
their recommendations. But, that might be a good question for, say, Omar.
I think too
Mhm.
that there's other ways that people know that it's someone's paper. So like with my
Mhm.
estrangement research, there aren't many of us who do it. So like I don't even have
Right.
to like everyone's gonna. I mean, for the most part, a lot of people might guess that it's my paper or guess that I might be reviewing a
Mhm.
paper if they're writing about estrangement. So even without the request, there's
Mhm.
still like ways that people might
Mm-hmm.
know that you have a paper or you might guess who your reviewer is that I don't think that editors can
Mhm.
ever mitigate completely.
Well, I think that's true, but that's always a probabilistic guess, right? So I once got a nasty email from somebody who was like, oh, you're a fucking snob because you went to Princeton and now you're at UCLA and you don't realize you just lucked out in life. And how dare you give my paper a bad review? And I'm like, I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. I was not your reviewer. And, and then and then I
Oops.
ended up having a pleasant conversation with the person and basically told them he needs to chill the fuck out and not try and pick fights with people. And as it happens, I'm actually completely aware that I have a much better career than in the counterfactual where I started grad school in 2004 and went on the market in 2010. But so I mean, you can have guesses, but you don't actually know,
Sure.
right? And it may be that partly it depends on how small the field is, right? But like if somebody reviews a manuscript on the Oscars, they might think, oh, that's probably Rossman's paper because he's written 2 papers on the Oscars. But there's actually half a dozen people who've published sociology articles on the Oscars. So how do you know it's me and not Olaf
Mhm.
Sorensen or somebody?
I think by counting the number of times you or Sorensen are cited
Yeah.
within that piece, that's how you figure
Well, that's true, but I also think that
that.
so I actually think it's important to not do the author site removed thing because I think that actually makes it more obvious.
No, me too. So
Yeah.
do I.
Yeah, like if it says like in an analysis of 19,853 films from 1927 to 2005, where where the credit centrality was used as a metric, author removed. It's like, well, that's either me, Nicola Sparza, or Phil Bonasich,
Yeah, you're like,
right?
come
Whereas
on,
if the
guys.
citation's in there, it could just be that it's Olaf Sorensen and he likes our paper.
You've been listening to The Annex, an academic sociology podcast. You can visit our show site at sociocast.org/annex. We are on Twitter at Sociannex and on Facebook, The Annex Sociology Podcast. Our producer is Liseth Moreno. Music by Lena Orsa. I'm Joseph Cohen. Thank you for listening.